session of the 22nd National Convention on a very, very important and I would say innovative topic, that is dilution of fundamental taxation principles. Friends, in film industry, sometimes entire script is written or a film is taken for production, keeping in mind only one hero. Entire script or thought of starting with production of picture is based upon that hero. If that hero is not available, he will not start, the producer will not start with the picture. Such type of topics, friends, very important topics. We had only one person in our mind, that is today's speaker, Mr. Hero Rai, a very distinguished advocate, and we were very happy that he readily accepted our invitation. And of course, our beloved Pranamata Binji, she also readily accepted our invitation to chair this session. And without taking much time, I will request Madam Bansal to please take over the charge of this session.
Good noon, friends. It is a morning session, but about to come to noon. So good noon, friends. And my subject is very interesting subject, diluting provisions in the Income Tax Act. What can be diluted? If government wants to tax any income is to be taxed, there is no problem. But where any receipt is taxed, then it creates a problem. And therefore, the name is given deeming provisions. What is to be deemed? The receipt which government wants to tax, that is the deeming provision. That is the simple formula. Deeming provision is an edict of legislature. It is a weapon in the hands of government to tax what is really not the income. So what is the meaning of deeming provision? What is to be deemed? Oxford Dictionary defines to deem means to believe, to consider, to judge, or count to be. Similarly, Webster's 9th dictionary says to come to think or judge or consider, to have an opinion. Deeming provision creates a legal fiction. But that is not only the purpose of deeming provision. There are 4 objects and purpose which are served by the deeming provisions. The first is to create a legal fiction by declaring that something which is not exists. 2, to declare the law. To cure the defect in the provision, then deeming provision is inserted. Similarly, to create a legal presumption by declaring that certain facts are to be taken as established. What is section 278E? It says that there is a presumption that you have a mens rea. Very, very crucial provision. Now it is on the accused to defend himself that there was no mens rea. Otherwise, what is the provision that negative cannot be established by anybody? But 278E says that accused has to establish that. The 4th one is to confer discretion. If no power is given to the department, to the assessing officer, then he cannot. So the deeming provision are very important provisions. What Godavari Sugar Mill says, that word deemed is too apt to include the obvious, the uncertain, and the impossible one. So everything has been included. There are so many provisions, so many deeming provisions in the Income Tax Act. I invite my legal illuminary, Mr. Hero Roy, that he is a real jewel in legal luminaries. I invite him to throw light on deeming provisions. Mr. Hero Roy, please.
Mrs. Bansal, thank you very much for the kind words. So also Vipul, thank you so much. Dignitaries on the dais, seniors in the profession, and friends. Can you hear me clearly? A good mid-morning to each one of you. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me over this morning. The topic assigned to me is dilution of fundamental taxation principles or deeming provisions. I propose to structure my talk in a particular manner. What I propose to do is I will refer to certain fundamental taxing principles. I will then refer to how those are being diluted by a host of provisions, the difficulties that those provisions create. So these three I will take together, because otherwise one has to go and come back and forth. So I will take all these together. Then I propose to go into the reasons as to why these provisions are being inserted, and finally my conclusion. Starting with the first limb, what are the fundamental taxation principles? There are many of them, but I will restrict myself to the more important ones. One of the main taxation principles, fundamental taxation principles, is that one can tax receipts which are in the nature of income, not capital receipts. The trend is to go on taxing and bring more and more capital receipts into the tax net. One of the earliest provisions that comes to mind to tax capital receipts are capital gains. Normally, capital gains are not income, they're capital receipts. But then legislature thought it fit that people are making windfalls, so let us introduce taxation on capital gains. The insertion was challenged, matter went right up to the Supreme Court, and at that point of time, way back in 1954, the Supreme Court laid down that the term income in the entry to the then Government of India Act is to be construed in a very, very wide manner, since it occurs in a legislature which gives legislative power. So this is a fundamental thing we have to keep in mind, that this is the view of the highest court of the land, that the word income is so broad, so wide, that it can even cover capital gains. The other point worth noting is that with passage of time, one tends to accept what has been legislated. This is a classic example of capital gains. today nobody talks as to why capital gains are being taxed. But the fundamental fact is that these are capital receipts. So with passage of time, you tend to accept certain things. In recent times, there have been a spate of amendments to bring more and more capital receipts into the tax net. And the most classic example are the amendments in section 56(2). And if we go through all the amendments in section 56(2), it shows how slowly and steadily the noose of the legislature is getting tighter and tighter. We started with 56(2) small Roman 5, which was inserted with effect from AY 56, to say that if after 1904, an individual or HUF, see how restricted it was in the beginning, if an individual or an HUF receives a sum of money, what is taxable was sum of money, exceeding 25,000 rupees without consideration, then that is to be treated as income. Of course, there were and there are exceptions, as for instance, a receipt under a will, a receipt by way of inheritance, gifts on the occasion of marriage. There are certain exemptions, receipts from relatives. So this was the starting point, 56(2)(5) with effect from AY 56. So we followed the fundamental principle of these deeming provisions have to be strictly construed. So we brought out all kinds of arguments, saying that first of all, this refers to sum of money. It says received from a person. So what if you receive from more than one person? Then there was no clarity whether this refers to a previous year or not. So we got smart, so they got smarter. And with effect from AY 78, 56(2)(6) was inserted. And it said after 1406, there were subtle amendments made. They increased the limit to 50,000. Then they said aggregate from person or persons. So earlier we would argue that limit of 25 is per person. So they got wiser, they said no. Aggregate from a person or persons. So you have to aggregate everything. This is how the law moved. Still not satisfied. 56(2)(7) with effect from AY 1011. Now what was covered was sum of money. So people started receiving otherwise than in money. So they said we must cover those also. So they say after 11009, if apart from a sum of money, you receive an immovable property without consideration, then the stamp duty value of that immovable property will also become your income. And it was a peculiar provision. Immovable property you receive without consideration, that was income. But movable property without consideration or for inadequate consideration, that is what was already covered. So then again they realized this lacuna, okay, why the distinction between movable and immovable? So they said, okay, from AY 1415, even immovable property without consideration or for inadequate consideration, both are getting covered. See how it is moving. AY 1314, 56(2)(7)(b) is inserted. If a company, not being a company in which the public are substantially interested, issues shares for a consideration which is more than the face value of the shares, then that excess, a part of that could be taxed as income in as much as that exceeded the fair market value. That fair market value was to be as per the method prescribed in Rule 11UA. 11UA prescribed the NAV method or the DCF method, discounted cash flow method. So this gave quite a lot of leeway. That is the reason why possibly 56(2)(7)(b) has not created all that damage. And more importantly, apart from the prescribed value, 56(2)(7)(b) also said either the prescribed value or such value as the company may justify to the satisfaction of the assessing officer. So other than the prescribed methods, you could even satisfy the assessing officer otherwise, ke the price at which I have issued, the premium which I have charged for this share is justifiable. So this, what I would call a residue provision, provided a safeguard whereby the assessee could satisfy the assessing officer that yes, the value at which the premium I have charged is fair and reasonable. So possibly this is one main reason why 5627B has not really posed very great a problem. There have been disputes, fair enough, but it has not posed that great a problem. Now comes the icing on the cake. What is the present provision? 56.210. So far, individuals and HUFs were covered. Now 56.210, with effect from AY 1819, says if after 1417, any person, so any person as defined in 231 would include all others other than individual and HUF. If any person receives any property, whether movable or immovable, without consideration or for inadequate consideration, the fair market value, the difference between that fair market value and the consideration would be brought to tax. How you determine the fair market value? Rule 11UA is what has been prescribed. The problem is, they have prescribed this method of Rule 11UA, which is far from reality. 11UA broadly refers to the market value of all the assets of the company minus the liabilities. In that manner, they derive the value of the shares. Major problem being created is in the case of shares. I am aware of heaps of transactions where transactions are between absolutely unconnected parties at negotiated prices, which prices are real prices, which one could really call arm's length prices. But they turn out to be different from the 11UA value, because 11UA value just gives market value of the assets minus the liabilities. So this is creating a huge difficulty. The problem is, as distinguished from 5627B, 56.210 does not give scope to an assessee to try and justify his value. We saw the residuary provision in 56.27B, but unfortunately in 56.210, there is no provision, there's no saving provision for the assessee to try and show that his price is correct. This, in times to come, transactions are already taking place. Now people are realizing the difficulty that is faced. Post the transaction, everybody is realizing, okay, I'm getting into a major problem because of this. And this is the reason I'm told, a lot of the organizations are contemplating. I'm told there is a writ petition which is in the process of being prepared and filed. Let's see what the courts hold in this regard. So this is how a classic example of capital receipts being roped into the tax net, and see how the law has progressed right from 56.25 right to 56.210. They're all encompassing provisions. They're really creating a lot of difficulties. The main target of a lot of these provisions are gifts. Fair enough, accepted. Now, another recent provision in the context of gifts, I think is going to create a lot of heartburn. People will realize it. And that is 918. After 5719, if a resident pays a sum to a non-resident, a sum which falls within 56(2)(10), a sum of money that is without consideration, etc. So if a resident pays a sum of money to a non-resident, say for example a gift is made, the same shall be deemed to accrue or arise in India. As you are all aware, 9 is a section which deals with incomes deemed to accrue or arise in India. And this is one more transaction. We had royalties, interest, fees for technical services. Now 918 is inserted. Otherwise, one would argue that that receipt by the non-resident has been outside India. So even if it falls within 56(2)(10), it cannot be taxed in India because it's not received in India, it doesn't accrue or arise in India. But 918 now says it shall be deemed to accrue or arise in India. So this is an instance of one of the fundamental principles of taxation, namely capital receipts being brought to tax, how the law is progressing in that regard. What more is to be coming? Let's wait and watch. Yet another fundamental principle which is slowly being eroded is the concept of real income. It's very well settled that if income does not result at all, there cannot be tax. Many Supreme Court decisions, we had Shurji Vallabhdas, 46 ITR 146. We had Godhra Electricity, 225 ITR 746. We had the famous Raman and Company, 67 ITR page 11, which laid down income which accrues to an assessee is taxable, income which he should have but has not earned cannot be brought to tax. Income which I should have earned but did not earn cannot be brought to tax. One of the provisions which has been there for quite some time, which is diluting this principle, has been the concept of notional house property income. It has been around for quite some years, but the application of this section has gained momentum in the last maybe decade or little over a decade, when people having multiple properties are faced with this situation and substantial, very substantial additions are being made in their hands on the ground that your second or third or fourth property is, the neighboring flat is fetching so many lakhs a month, so this should be the annual value. You have not even earned that money. It was just an investment by you. But this deeming provision charges you tax on an income which you have not earned at all, what you should have earned. This is a classic example of deeming provisions. Now, sometimes provisions are there on the statute, but they hit you after a long time. Now, take the classic case of builders. As it is the builders, the entire industry is in a bad shape. To top it, they have huge quantities of unsold stock. To top it, this deeming provision is the department is applying to say that you will be charged to tax on the deemed notional income, the sum for which the property may be expected to let. So you imagine the impact it has on builders. I could have 10 buildings where hardly a flat could be sold. You imagine what is my plight. We had the Delhi High Court decision in Ansal's case, which upheld the leviability of house property income on the stock of these builders. I personally held a view otherwise. I had made my submissions and arguments in the course of a talk I had delivered on 1 or 2 occasions. But yes, these decisions are there, this problem is real. Now, how the problem gets further compounded? Now, the legislature has inserted section 23(5) in the Act, which says that for the year in which you have got your CC, the completion certificate of your premises, plus for 1 year thereafter. Now it has been extended to 2 years. It says your annual value shall be deemed to be nil. Problem is, they thought they are giving us a concession. But the fact of the matter is, the very insertion of this provision is creating difficulty for the earlier years. Because the department is latching on to this provision to say that, see, the legislature itself contemplates that there is to be an annual value. That is why they are saying that for these initial years, it should be taken as nil. So our case to say that house property income should not be brought to tax in such cases gets weaker. In fact, the main argument that we were making to say that builders should be out, if you read the provisions of section 22, it says the annual value of lands or buildings or lands appurtenant thereto, of which the assessee is the owner, other than such portion or portions which he occupies for the purposes of his business. These were excluded. Our argument was that the builder, when he is in possession of his stock, he is occupying the same for the purposes of his business. And that is why we were out of section 22. This was the view I had expressed. Say, for example, you have possession of your place, you are trying to sell it, your prospective buyers are coming, you're showing them the premises. So how can you say this is not used for the purpose of your business or occupied for the purpose of your business? Nevertheless, that is a matter to be argued. But what I'm trying to point out is this deeming provision in section 23(5) further accentuates the problem when it says that the annual value is to be taken as nil. Another provision which has been inserted of late, it's been a few years now, example of taxing income which you have not earned. Classic example, section 50C of the Act, which says that whatever your consideration may be, if the stamp duty value of the building or land which you have transferred is more than your consideration, the consideration is to be the stamp duty value. So here is again a case, you are being taxed on something which you have not received. Of course, presuming you have not received anything unaccounted. The problem arises here that very often the stamp duty values are far divorced from the fair market values. And therefore, a lot of assessees get into the net of section 50C. Yes, there is a saving provision, and because of this provision, the constitutional validity of section 50C has been upheld. And that saving provision is that if you feel that the stamp duty value is more than the fair market value, you can object to the value, and the AO is therefore bound to refer the matter to the departmental valuation officer. Fair enough, provision is good, but we all know what kinds of problems are created by the departmental valuation officer, merely for the simple reason that he is the departmental valuation officer. So we have deeming fictions among deeming fictions. Now see how further difficulties get created. 50C deeming provision, fair enough. We have succeeded in several cases before the tribunals where there was a marginal difference, say 10%, 12%, even 15%. We got away with section 50C saying that these marginal differences should not be added under section 50C. The logic was, if you recollect, the earlier chapter 20A provisions, the chapter 20C provisions, which spoke of acquisition and purchase of immovable properties, they gave a margin of 15%. And relying upon that logic, even KP Varghese' case, where there can be genuine differences between the value at which a transaction takes place and the stamp duty value, up to 10, 12, 15%, we have succeeded. There are a host of tribunal decisions. Now, there's a proviso inserted in 50C, which says that they will permit you 5% margin. What's the logic? why you deem such a percentage of 5% only to be a marginal difference which is acceptable? Why not 10%? Why not 15%? So all those cases where we were succeeding, those become questionable. And to add to it, Kolkata bench of the tribunal has recently held that this proviso is retrospective. So even for earlier years, you are stuck with that 5%. See the impact of arguments made. In that case, the assessee's margin was less than 5%. So he argued that, see, this proviso is helping me. So that's why the tribunal said, yes, it is helping you in the retrospective. See how it hits all the others. So one should therefore always be very careful while making an argument as to what is the impact it can have on the assessees as a whole. 50C has been extended to business cases also now, 43CA. So if there's a builder, earlier 50C could not apply obviously because that was not transfer of a capital asset, because 50C is qua capital assets, capital gains. 43CA was inserted to make a similar addition qua builders, in whose case the land and building was stock and trade. 50CA, this is a provision which is inserted with effect from AY 1819. This is a provision which is going to hit hard in times to come. If you transfer unquoted shares of a company and the consideration is less than the value as determined in 11UAA, Rule 11UAA, the value so determined under that rule is to be taken as the consideration. 11UAA takes you to Rule 11UA. So the same difficulties that I expressed in the context of 56(2)(10) are going to arise in the context of 50CA also, because both take you back to the same rule. Only problem is, both the sides get affected now. 56(2)(10) affects the purchaser, and 50CA impacts the seller. And both are being taxed at absolutely unreasonable amounts. Another example we can refer to in the context of taxing income which you have nearly not accrued would be the TP provisions. Transactions between international transactions between associated enterprises are supposed to be at arm's length price. You may not have actually received the amount, but your transaction is to be taken at arm's length price. So adjustments are made based on all the rules that are referred to therein. To top it, now we have even secondary adjustments. The problem is these kind of provisions, as you have seen, TP has resulted into a huge amount of litigation. Huge is huge. A lot of bigger centers where the tribunals have benches, they have separate benches for transfer pricing. In Bombay, you have a specific bench. Earlier, we had 2 for transfer pricing. So also Delhi. Possibly, wiser sense is prevailing. Now we are having APAs, advanced pricing arrangements. So possibly that is hopefully going to reduce some litigation in this regard. 2 main fundamental principles we've seen so far. 1, capital receipts. Number 2, real income theory. One more fundamental principle laid down repeatedly by the courts. An assessee can arrange his affairs so as to minimize his tax burden. This was a very well settled principle even earlier. It came under a little cloud when we had McDowell's judgment, 154 ITR. A lot of commotion got created. Thankfully, the situation was remedied by a series of judgments after McDowell's case. In Azadi Bachao, 263 ITR. Then we had Walfort, 326 ITR. Then we had Vodafone's case, 341 ITR. all have laid down that yes, tax planning is permissible and assessee can arrange his affairs. Forget colorable transactions, that you leave apart. But judicial tax planning, genuine methods have been accepted. No problem on that. Classic instance was Walford, which we thought would not be accepted, but it got accepted ultimately by the Supreme Court. Dividend stripping transactions, if you recollect, that is what was accepted by the Supreme Court in Walford's case, 94-7. All these is there. Now we have a new animal called GAR. This is going to unsettle all this. I think a lot of Gujaratis ears, you know the meaning of GAR in Gujarati. That is what it is to taxpayers. Under these provisions, any arrangement can be declared to be an impermissible avoidance arrangement. Now, this term IAA has been defined very broadly. If the main purpose of an arrangement is to avoid tax or to obtain a tax benefit, if the main purpose of your arrangement is to obtain a tax benefit, and you satisfy one of 4 other conditions, namely A, B, C, D, which are there. One of them says is resulting in directly or indirectly the misuse or abuse of the provisions of the law, or something which lacks commercial substance. There are 4 such conditions there. So if the main purpose is to obtain a tax benefit and you satisfy one of these 4, then you're caught within the expression IAA. It will be determined to be an impermissible avoidance arrangement. What happens? The department has got virtually unlimited power to do what they want with you. It is just like tying your hands and legs and flogging you. That's what is the real effect. They can ignore, they can recharacterize, they can do what they want. They can ignore the transaction, they can rechristen the transaction, they can ignore parties, whatever they want, they can do. Saving provision is Section 144BA, which lays down that this has to be approved by an approving panel on which there has to be a High Court judge who is to be sitting. This is a saving grace. The provisions say there is no appeal provided under the Act, so possibly the only remedy would be a writ petition. And to what extent writ petitions will be really helpful, because at times courts tend to say that we will not go into highly factual matters, which is correct also in principle. But in this context, it will be interesting to see how the law develops. In the absence of an appeal, every person will have to go to the High Court by way of a writ petition. Let us see how things unfold themselves, because these are extremely dangerous provisions and everything depends on how well or how fairly they are implemented. Another fundamental taxation principle, I'll digress a bit. I don't claim to know anything on GST, but I'm personally hit in the sense the concept of mutuality, I am told, is being hit by GST. We all staying in cooperative housing societies, and all our chartered accountants are advising us, okay, don't fight unnecessarily. Whatever, you charge the GST paid and don't take up cudgels with the department. Now we have a Supreme Court decision in Calcutta Club's case. Let's see how law develops hereafter. What the GST experts have to say, I am nobody to say anything because my knowledge is very limited. But let's see what the GST experts have to say with this. I come on to the next stage of my talk, and that is, we saw the principles. We saw how these main principles are diluted. And it would make some sense. It would give a sense of proportion to the entire debate if we go into the reasons as to why the legislature is doing these things. I think one should always look at a thing from both sides. The government, for instance, may want to increase its tax revenue. So they thought, yes, capital gains are windfalls which are being earned by the SSEs. So why not tax them? This is one of the reasons, and possibly justifiable reasons, why the government was justified in taxing some receipts. Another place where they may want to increase their revenue, take an example, MAT provisions. Personally speaking, I don't know, I do not understand the logic of giving deductions on one hand and taking them back from the other hand. You say that if your taxable income after all deductions, etc., is less than your book profit, we will charge you on book profit. What is the point? You are giving me deductions because you thought I was entitled to the deduction. So stick to that. Why do you want to take it back from the other hand by levying a tax on book profit? Nevertheless, these are the provisions we have. Another reason why government resorts to such things is that they may want to protect their tax base. Classic example is transfer pricing. MNCs have been indulging in all kinds of practices whereby the tax revenues of the country are being lost. So that's why they thought, and fairly thought, that yes, all the transactions between these associated enterprises must be done at the arm's length prices so that the tax base of, say, India is protected. Some cases, one of the reasons is to prevent avoidance of tax, to prevent mischief. Classic example is Section 50C. Immovable properties was one area where the maximum amount of unaccounted money was passing. Let's accept it, it's a fact. 50C, insertion thereof, has definitely made a difference, in as much as at least the transactions are now being done at the stamp duty value. Of course, the entire thing cannot be obliterated, but yes, it has had a salutary effect. 56(2), I'm not saying all of them are justified, but their main target was gifts. Everybody got gifts from all and sundry, and we justified capacity, genuineness of the transaction. Everything was justified. Now when these provisions have come, I don't know, really speaking, the gifts have reduced, or what is coming to our knowledge is reduced, I don't know. But I think it will have a salutary effect, in as much as at least a lot of those bogus gifts, people will at least think twice. Take another classic example, a very old provision, but the purpose behind it is to avoid mischief. 222E, deemed dividend provisions. If a closely held company gives a loan to a person having a substantial interest in the company, what was being done by SSEs earlier was, the private limited company had profits, they took a loan for all times to come. That is why 222E was inserted, to say that this shall be deemed to be income. Otherwise, the SSEs were very clearly getting away with it. It's just a loan, so it's not income at all. So I can hold on to it perpetually for all times to come. So those things were what were sought to be roped in by 222E. But really speaking, consequences, take an example. I was desperately in need of money for some reason, genuine reason. My private limited company had the funds. I had to buy my house, I needed the money for some time. I took a loan from the company. After 1 month, I have returned the same because my old house got sold, the monies came to me. I repaid the loan to the company and I paid interest also to the company. But still Supreme Court says no, it is going to be taxed. The moment you have taken that loan, it becomes taxable. These are the unfortunate consequences of hard provisions. Another reason why the government resorts to such provisions is they may want to simplify certain provisions. They want to have ease of computation. Take, for example, 44BB. 44BB is a provision which says that in case of non-residents, if they are providing facilities or services or plant and machinery, etc., for oil exploration, then 10% of the receipts are to be treated as income. That's what 44BB says. It's a deeming provision, yes, 10% is deemed to be your income. But see the reason behind it. In the case of that non-resident, who is going to go behind the actual computation of that income? It'll give a lot of difficulties. They may have expenses abroad. Everybody will go into whether that was justified or no. So a lot of litigation should ensue. That is why the legislature thought it fit. 44BB is a good provision. We will deem 10% of the receipts to be your income. And mind you, the validity of the provision is fair, would be upheld, also on the ground that there's a provision in the section which says that if you have actually earned lesser, you maintain books of account, you have them audited, and you prove that you have earned lesser. If you're able to prove, no problem. That is also acceptable. So see the fairness of the provision. They say we will deem 10% to be income or any lesser amount which you are able to substantiate. Fair enough. Mode of computation, another example is 45(2), conversion of capital asset into stock and trade. At the stage of conversion of a capital asset into stock and trade, there is a deemed transfer under capital gains, but there would be a difficulty to people. You have not actually encashed that asset. All you have done is convert that capital asset into stock and trade. That is why 45(2) says that yes, there is a transfer, but only later on when you sell that stock, would you be charged to tax in respect of both the business income as also the capital gains. So this is a case where the legislature has provided a methodology as to how you will determine income so that there is no problem when it actually happens, how does one compute the income. So first stage would be capital gains, second stage would be business income. 44AD is another provision which deals with taxation of business income on presumptive basis. People having turnover of less than 2 crores can pay tax at 8% or 6% as the case may be. Salutary provisions. But the problem is there's a constant tug of war from the side of the department and from the side of the assessees. Sometimes both get unfair. Department, say for example, in the context of 44BB, when they said you have to take 10% of the receipts as your income, they said service tax is also a receipt. Service tax you have received is also a receipt. Therefore, on that also we will levy 10%. It's grossly unfair because where is the question of there being a profit component then? That is why now the law is getting settled to say that qua the service tax receipt, there could be no question of the 10% income thereon. Therefore, that should be excluded from the receipts. That's one example of how the department was stretching things too far. Yes, assessees are also not far behind. In fact, they are quite ahead. Department seems to catch up after some time. Classic example of 44AD, presumptive taxation. I want to pay tax at 8%, but I want to capitalize much more. There's a risk. I pay tax at 8% of my receipts, but I invest in a flat, saying that my bank account shows 25–30% of my receipts are my income. To my mind, there are people who disagree with that, but to my mind, this is a very dangerous situation. Do not capitalize more than what you have returned, because the provision speaks of 8% or such higher amount as the assessee may declare. Therefore, to my mind, if you want to capitalize more, you should declare the higher amount. It's pretty dangerous. I'll wind up my talk with my conclusion. On the one hand, government has all these provisions, and on the other hand, the assessee trying to stretch things too much. I think the solution lies in appreciating the other person's point of view. I think most problems everywhere, not only in tax, can be solved if one appreciates an issue from an other person's viewpoint. You will appreciate the difficulty, and then possibly you will come down in your argument. My thought would be, having done this, if it is fair and just, yes, you should have no grudge. But if despite that, it is unfair and unreasonable, I think you should stand up and challenge it. Because there's a nice, apt saying by somebody which says, those people have rights who dare maintain them. Thank you.
Hello.
Friends, Mr. Rai has explained so many provisions. It appears that it is the government which can do anything. But it appears that that is for the benefit of the public. The glaring example of deeming provisions, which everyday department uses that weapon, are provisions of section 68 to 69D. I mean, every day government is using that provision. Any sum found credited in the books of accounts of the SSE, any unexplained investment not recorded in the books of SSE, unexplained expenditure is that, investment is that, even proviso to section 69D is there that any expenditure is not allowed from the deemed provisions. So these are very disastrous. And when section 115 BBE is inserted, that income has to be taxed at the rate of 30% outrightly. And thereafter penalty provisions. In every case, there is a misreporting or underreporting. Who will save the SSE? Wherever there is an addition, then it is the case of underreporting. So, one more example I am giving, that as per section 5, income accrued to the non-resident SSE is not, if it is not accrued in India, then that is not taxable. But after Vodafone case, what has happened? Transaction between two non-residents. Transaction have entered into out of India. But if there is a transactions of share, but those shares are carrying their values from the Indian asset, then that is the income accrued to the non-resident SSE in India. So at certain places, I think that even SSE is also incorrect. I mean, they are trying too much to evade the tax, and therefore these deemed provisions are there. So one more is section 115JB. Book profit is to be taxed at the rate of 18.5% in the case of companies and even in the case of other SSEs as well. So I think that there are so many deeming provisions that half of the act incorporates the deeming provision. But in any case, we are to abide by those provisions. Friends, now I invite the audience to have any queries in their minds. Then our speaker is there to give answer. It is the interactive session. So if anybody wants to put any query, then we will give the answers.
Sir, when we prepare discounted cash flow statement for determining the value, So by the time we get assessment, our actual results are out. So the actual results never tell it with the discounted cash flow. Even if it is an infrastructure company, we are facing a lot of difficulties, and they are saying that you have projected valuation at 10%, but it is coming minus 2%. So your valuation is wrong and additions are being made. How to face this situation?
Can you hear me? Yeah. I think by now we have a few decisions also. If you do a little research, there are some tribunal decisions available. My personal view would be that if you could show some reasonable basis for your projections at that point of time, not just some flat percentages. If you could show some reasonable basis for those projections, to my mind, I think you can get out. Because you cannot always project what are going to be actuals. It's not fair to compare actuals with projections. You could have certain situations which have arisen because of which the actuals have really gone up. See, business could have changed. Something could have happened. The world is developing so fast. That is my view. And I think there are some decisions, including, I think if you look at some Bangalore tribunal decisions and some Jaipur bench decisions, I think there are some decisions.
Sir, in case of infrastructure company, initially the problems are too much and losses are incurred. But we cannot transfer the old shareholders cannot accept the valuation as per actual. It has to be the like licenses or something, infrastructure, we apply for the things and the change in the land rates. So many inputs are there, but department is not agreeing. They are.
I know that is a problem. That is the fallout of their sticking to the method referred to in 11 UA. That is the problem with the provision. Let's see what the courts hold when these provisions are challenged. Let's wait for that.
But I think in case of infrastructure, 11 UA is not applicable.
Sorry?
If the share belongs to infrastructure company, the rule 11 UA is not applicable.
If it is not happening, then you have no problem.
That is my opinion. Are you agreeing with me?
I don't have the rules here before me, but do you think there's a specific exception for
Yes,
infrastructure?
yes. Explanation there, infrastructure.
Okay. So if there is a specific exception, then there's no problem. Then you can justify it fairly. But the same thing, my answer would still be the same, that if you can justify the way you projected, your projections, I think there should not be a problem. That's
But
the view.
the problems come when the assessment is made, all the projections go wrong.
Accepted. That is the reason why you have to show what was the basis of your projections. Later on at the assessment stage, you have actual figures, but you still have to give the basis for your projections. Just like any valuation report, you see, we used to file valuation reports, say for 1481 value, any possible value we were giving, right? Not that the department has to accept that. One has to go into the basis. What is the strength of that valuation report? I think that was the logic. What is the strength of that valuation report? Your valuer could just say, according to me, the value is so much. No, there has to be some comparable cases. Yes. There has to be some basis for your values. If the department is able to contradict your values by saying, no, see the comparable instances, they are different, so they will not accept it. I think the same logic would apply as to how you are not speaking of comparable cases, but how you are able to justify the strength of your valuation report. That's my view.
Any other query? Yes.
Mr. Rao, for the purpose of 11 UA, in case of chain of investment companies, to arrive the real valuation, resulting asset valuation, to what extent we can go? A, B, C, D, E?
It's a great problem. You go into one, you go into the next, you go into...
How valuation exercise can be done really? This is a very challenging.
I appreciate that's a major problem, but that's a flaw with the rule. You have you are valuing A company that has shares in B company. So you have to value those shares, then that B company has shares in C company, and the chain goes on.
Yes.
It really brings a huge value. I appreciate this problem, but that's unfortunately the way the rule is worded.
What is practical proposition? Haridwar, Gangotri, Gomukh and beyond.
But there is no halt. They're not laying down a limit in the rule, are they?
That is
the whole problem. So
any practical suggestion in such problems?
no, I think you better take care of all that. Suggestion would be try and take care of every stage and you value
No,
it.
but
in that
certain
manner.
companies may not
Until
be in your
otherwise-
control.
Other practical thing is to wait for the High Court decision.
Yes.
But certain
and watch.
company, certain entities are not in your control also to take the
appreciate
data and for valuation.
Or
That is
make-
why-
Or make representation to the government that there have to be some cut-off point.
Yes.
So
I
that-
believe representations have already been made. Representations have already been made. But these are problems with the rule. That's the whole problem. That is why there's a good chance to challenge it. Though there is one viewpoint of the courts, that's not final.
Regarding section 50 CA, rule
Yeah.
11 UA, certificate of CA or merchant banker is required before filing the return.
That is-
You don't, sorry, where is this?
Section 50 CA,
Yes.
sale of unlisted shares,
Huh.
rule 11 UA,
Huh.
is a certificate of merchant banker or CA required before filing the return?
I think you must have it to know your tax liability, is it not? Filing is another thing, but when you enter into the transaction, I think you should have that report before you so that you can file your return in a proper manner. You can structure your transaction in the right manner. That would be the.
Sir, how can a CA value the certificate? A private limited company may have 200 shareholders, and one significant shareholder has no control over the private limited company.
These are all, I appreciate, these are all difficulties. You can value the shares of maybe a group which holds the main shares. But some people who have smaller quantity of shares, these are difficulties. I appreciate.
The management will not allow you to value their shares. They
Yes.
will not allow the CA or merchant banker to value their balance sheet, etc., and the market value of the balance sheet assets. This is the problem of it's not a family-owned private limited company of 5 or 7 shareholders. There may be 100, 200, 300 shareholders. The private limited company will not allow you to touch their balance sheet.
I see a difficulty, but I think all you can do is try and make a representation to your board, okay, this is the difficulty I'm facing, and see what they are. See their.
Yes,
Response.
because those balance sheets are not in the public domain. So it's very difficult to evaluate the
I
shares.
appreciate the difficulty.
This is a very obnoxious provision
Yes,
and
yes.
must be struck down.
Yes, yes. In fact, these are the examples, these are the precise examples that must be brought out in the representations and in the petitions so as to bring out the problems with the provision. Whoever issues the certificate, may even if it's a merchant banker, but still the difficulty remains even for the merchant banker.
In case of 50C, so I'm here.
Yes.
Both the parties are hit, no? The buyer is also hit by a gift, deemed gift.
Yes, yes.
So
Now
there is a
yes.
double taxation in that.
No, taxation in two different hands. No?
Yeah.
It's not double taxation in that sense.
Two different hands for
Two
the same
different hands.
transaction.
No, but I have read one case where it is held that it is only in the hands of seller.
No.
Because that is the deeming provision. So it cannot
Until-
be in
until
the
fi-
hands of buyers.
So what I would feel is until 56 to 10 came into the picture, yes, that was the position. You could apply 50C only to the seller. But now with 56 to 10, which taxes the difference between the stamp duty value and the consideration in the hands of the buyer, that would be up after 56.
10. Okay.
After 50, because the logic would be it is for a consideration less than the stamp duty value.
Yes, 56 to 10
10.
is there. Otherwise, before that provision, only in the hands of seller, that is to
Fair.
be the. Now in both the ways. Any other query, friends?
Sir, as you said, 44 AD dimming, 8% and higher he may declare. Now this being a dimming clause, and whether to declare more than 8% is also a optional, and still they go into real income as capitalization is more than our income, then what is the purpose of dimming? Then it will be redundant. So can we say that once you dim like this, then irrespective of my capitalization, etc., they cannot go into further details? And more particularly when they have said that books should not be maintained or may not be maintained. So with that option, is it?
Like I said, many people do not agree to my viewpoint. That is precisely the other viewpoint. But I don't think it makes the section redundant. If a person is not trying to capitalize more than the 8% or 6% which you are offering as income, it's not becoming redundant. You are making it redundant by trying to get more benefit of more white money and paying less tax. That is my personal view. You may not agree with it.
Only because of deeming clause. Deeming,
No, no,
whether deeming is
it
also
is
equal
deeming,
to same.
it is deeming a certain percentage to be your income. That is only for ease of computation. So that there is no problem in difficulty in small traders proving expenses, etc. That is the logic behind it. But logic is not to give you benefit when in fact you have earned much more, you pay lesser. In fact, yes, a lot of people are going to get away with it by having earned much more as long as you don't capitalize it. Otherwise, I think it is very risky. If you capitalize more and you try to take benefit of that, I think it is very risky.
That is too risky. If you have earned more income and declaring only 8%, that you cannot capitalize more than 8% of the profit, otherwise it is very risky. Okay, even if you are earning less, then also you have to maintain the account.
Then books are not to be maintained, then how they will come to know that I earn more or what is
Say
it?
for example, you are buying a flat, the example I gave. You are saying that I'm not maintaining books fair enough, but in my bank passbook the money is there. I can explain the source of that money. That is the case which will get caught. Another small clarification I may make in this regard is that when you look at that 6 or 8%, there could be certain items which you can use to add to that 6 or 8%. For example, depreciation. Depreciation is not a cash loss. So suppose you are having certain assets. Say for example, you had an office premises or a shop or you have a car. That depreciation is an element which you can compute and add to your 6 or 8% so as to become available for user. Fair enough. But if you can bring out such items so as to add to that 6 or 8%, to that extent you would be safe. But blanket saying that you have returned 8% and you are saying using 30%, to my mind is risky.
Because sales tax deeming provisions are applicable only as per the amendments done in the Constitution 266. How far is your view?
To my mind, every act, every section has to abide by the Constitution. And if it is found to...
No.
Department 266 amendment is only applicable to the 7 items which have been amended and treated as a same. In the same manner, whether
It falls.
all incomes which have been treated as a deemed
Wind up.
income is covered by the Constitution.
See, I am not aware of the sales tax provisions, but
नहीं, नहीं.
to my mind, every deeming provision would have to be tested on the anvil of the constitutional provisions. If it falls short of them, then it can be challenged. If no, you have to live. That's the way I look at it.
Judgment has given by the High Court that deeming provisions are only those which have been specifically amended and treated as amended.
If it falls within the legislative entry, I mean list 1 of Schedule 7, then it is the constitutional. If it falls outside the entry, then it is unconstitutional. And in any case, it is passed by both the houses of parliament and thereafter presidential assent is there. So,
And
I
to
think
add...
that,
Sorry.
so I think that that is the constitution, otherwise challenge on any other ground that it creates discrimination or anything else, then it can be challenged on the constitutional ground within the court of law, in the court.
Sir, this is the last question.
Last question now.
Last question I'm just raising.
To my mind, in that case, you can ask for a reference to the valuation officer, and there you can put in your objections to say that this is as per the court decree. If the court has said that you can transfer only at an X price, then that is to be taken as the value. Yes. Denied to give the valuation report, then that is their problem. That itself shows that if I were to argue that matter, I would say in the tribunal. See, the very fact that he is not even giving a report shows that he has nothing to say. I have objected it. I have objected to the stamp duty value. I have done my duty. Huh.
नहीं हेमंत भाई एक बात पूछ रही हूँ, इज इट एक्चुअल केस because actually court doesn't give the decree on lesser than the stamp duty value.
I personally,
If it is a distress sell, then it can be. Otherwise,
to my mind, you have a very strong case. You can argue before the tribunal that this should be the fair market value. I don't see any problem in your case. You have a very strong case. No, there is no provision agree, but the DVO has to ascertain the fair market value. So there is a difference between fair market value and stamp duty value. As long as you have material to prove that your fair market value is different, in your case it's a foolproof case. In fact, your case would be stronger if some element of the consideration had passed at the time when the father had executed the agreement. Because there is a provision now in 50C which says that if there has been a payment by check or by a banking transaction, then the agreement, the value as at that time is to be taken. The stamp duty value at that time is to be taken. So if you have the stamp duty value at that point of time and you satisfy it, I don't see any problem.
Sir, this is the last
friends,
question.
we are running short
This
of
is the
time
last
and
question.
no further query.
This is the
because
last
the
question
next
with
session has to be.
supplement to that particular question. This is regarding the sale of immovable property, and as rightly questioned, the party has already executed an agreement in the year 2003. Okay, and part considerations have been paid, not in cash, not in check, but in cash. The AO at the time of assessment issued notice to the seller under section 50C and to the buyer under section 56 2B7. Okay, treating that because this 56 section it has been introduced in the year 2013, it came into existence, and the section says that it is other than by way of cash. The payment should be made other than by way of cash. Then only the agreement executed in the prior date will be applicable, otherwise not.
Yes, correct.
So in case of 50C, the selling dealer, the selling party, the AO has initiated the proceeding and dropped it, stating that yes, there was an agreement to sell. So accordingly, the agreement value will prevail and not the sale value. Because at the time of selling, which is after a decade, the value has gone up. And in the meanwhile, the purchasing dealer, after executing another power of attorney, has constructed a building over there. And while doing the sale of that property, the entire value of the construction as well as the cost of the land was declared in the sale deed.
Friend, I am pausing you because your query is very long. We are running short of time and Mr. Hero Roy is always open. You can contact him or you send the query to AIFTP. AIFTP will request Mr. Hero Roy.
That one question.
So friend, I am very sorry. We are abide by the principles of the conferences. So now I am handing over the mic to organizer.
Well, now may I request Mr. Bharat Swami to offer moment to our very dear chairperson, Mr. Bansal, for love and appreciation. And to Mr. Praveen Shinde, to Mr. Hero Rai, a mark of our appreciation for his agreeing to deliver a very illuminating lecture. Now may I request Mr. Bhaskar Patel to offer a vote of thanks?
Chairperson of this technical session, Senior Advocate Srimati Premlata Bansal ji, Speaker, Advocate Hero Roy, Mr. Vipul Joshi, organizing this technical session, Mr. Praveen Shinde, and Mr. Bharat Swami from Baroda, and the August gathering, those who have taken active participation to ask the related questions of today's subject. I, on behalf of all the organizers, to thank our speaker who has given justification to the subject which has been given to him. Each and every questions he has replied, and thoroughly they have given information regarding the provisions of our Income Tax Act, which is in force. Srimati Premlata Bansal, the senior advocate, have also deliberated the questions which are being raised by the August gathering. I, on behalf of all the organizers, thank you all. Thanks.